Today we have, I think, the last speaker section of this academic year.
Woohoo!
Yeah, Tushar is going to talk to us about dark noise.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sana and Niels, for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. This is a real privilege to be here. Doubly so because it's Niels. Niels and I go way back, as some of you know. And a lot of this material is born out of years of fighting, just really vicious fighting between us. And I'm trying to put a positive spin on it, and that's what this talk is. So I think Niels and I imagine many of us over here, share an impulse to at least be predisposed towards a certain kind of scientific realism. And as a philosopher, I want to investigate what it was that led me to this impulse, right? Why do I want to be a scientific realist? I remember having read something in Arthur Fine's Natural Ontological Attitude paper that I think sort of captures one good reason to be a scientific realist. I mean, there's any number of reasons, right? God could whisper to your ear that you ought to be a scientific realist. That seems like a perfectly fine reason to some. But this kind of captures the sort of what I call the naturalist realist impulse behind a particular kind of scientific realism, right? So Arthur Fine says it is possible to accept the evidence of one's senses and to accept in the same way the confirmed results of science only for a realist. For what it's worth, Fine doesn't actually think this is true. He thinks you don't have to be a realist in any sort of inflationary way to accept this. But I'm not going to engage with that bit. What I am going to engage with is just this impulse, because whether or not you think this impulse is true, I think this really does capture a particular kind of motivation for a sort of scientific realism. So it strikes me as a good impulse as far as it goes, but it actually doesn't go all that far, right? There's a whole lot more that you need to say, right? You need to talk about what these confirmed results of science are. I need to understand what acceptance is, and there's a whole literature on all of these things. But there is one aspect of things that I really do want to focus on more than anything else today, and that's this in the same way kind of locution, because I think that's playing a really important role in setting up a position of scientific realism, right? Because when you have an in the same way type thesis, you're expressing a yearning for a particular kind of uniformity, right? And you can sort of see this if you kind of so if you stare at this a little bit, with your sort of philosophical glasses on, you'll notice at least three kinds of uniformity kind of smushed into that in the same way. The first is what you could just call broadly a metaphysical uniformity, a kind of, at least with respect to the scientific realism debate, where it's a question over the status of observables versus unobservables, right? Things that we have perceptual access to versus those which we don't. A metaphysical uniformity thesis just tells us that the metaphysical status, however you spell that out, of your observables is going to be the same as the metaphysical status as your unobservables, right? Mind independent, blah blah blah, all of that stuff. I think that's one aspect of the in the same way that's going on here, right? But there's also a semantic uniformity, right? The idea is we treat the semantics that we use to talk about observables and unobservables, right? In particular, if you think of theoretical terms as in some sense corresponding to unobservables and observational terms in some sense corresponding to observables, then we treat these semantically the same way. We generally do that using model theoretic notions of reference and denotation, but that can be broader than that. But in general, model theoretic uniformity across the semantic treatment. And then, of course, there's an epistemic or epistemological uniformity, right? The kinds of things that we say are knowledge claims about unobservables are, from an epistemic perspective, not different from the kinds of knowledge claims that we make about unobservables, right? There's no kind of special knowledge of unobservables that's different from knowledge of observables. So I think these three uniformities together sort of largely capture that in the same way locution. Philosophers of science in the room will be familiar with how similar this looks to the standard set for scientific realism. Right? Scientific realism is usually cashed out as a kind of metaphysical realism claim, together with semantic realism and epistemic realism. So realisms understood this way are just a special case of the uniformities. Right? The realism is just tethering either the metaphysics or the semantics or the epistemic to the manner in which our observable discourse kind of takes place, right? So we use reference to talk about chairs, so we should use reference to talk about electrons. We think of chairs as mind-independent entities whose existence doesn't depend on our own existence, and we should think the same way about electrons, and so on, right? And so this is also one way in which naturalism is related to standard scientific realism. So standard scientific realism kind of entails naturalism. It's a special case of it. And so if you're a scientific realist, then you kind of get the naturalism for free. And so that seems like a good reason to be a scientific realist. Now, if you look at the more contemporary literature on scientific realism, a lot of the discussion has been around the epistemic realism. Post Van Fraasen, a lot of the discussion has been on the epistemic side of things, right? The idea is something like, sure, mind independent, blah, blah, blah. We know what we mean when we talk about electron, but really the interesting question is, do we have any reason to ascribe knowledge, the honorific knowledge to those sorts of claims? If you're a constructive empiricist, in general, you're going to say no with respect to claims about unobservables. What I want to do today is I want to focus on the semantic component of that. Because I think for all of their flaws, and God knows there are lots of them, the logical empiricists, I think, methodologically had one thing absolutely spot on, which is we need to know what the hell we're talking about before we do anything else, right? You can't have your metaphysics prior to your claims about semantics and your claims about epistemology, right? We need to know what those claims are in order to sort of accept them in the same way. So that's basically what my talk is going to be about today. I think interesting metaphysical and epistemological theses can be added to the kinds of semantic theses that I want to defend today. But really, the heart of the view is in the semantics. So given that, we should ask the question: what is the standard way in which we talk about semantic realism in the philosophy of science literature? And again, this is something that we've inherited from the logical empiricists. Post-logical empiricism, this is generally given a kind of model theoretic rendering, right? We have, the ideas are ontological commitments are sort of specified by the things in our domain of discourse that an interpretation function sort of maps our constants or our names to. And so then the interesting discussion is over whether, electron kind of picks out something in the domain of discourse or it doesn't. But I've got a couple of problems with this rendering of the debate. Sorry, it just occurs to me that I keep walking out of the frame over here. So maybe I shouldn't do that. Maybe I should just stay. I shouldn't wander. I kind of like having the performance space to be more sort of emphatic, but now I'm also just kind of distracted by anything. So there are many reasons why I think this kind of model theoretic rendering is harmful. But I think we can nonetheless understand the Feinian naturalist realist impulse without using model theory, without thinking about it in a model theoretic kind of way. So I think there are two problems that I want to focus on today with doing things model theoretically. The first is that physics in general is just not formulated model theoretically. Your physical theories, open any textbook on quantum field theory or string theory or even classical mechanics. You don't have domains of discourse and signatures and interpretation functions and all of that. You've got a bunch of equations. You've got a bunch of suggestions for how to model certain systems, certain subsystems, approximation procedures, that sort of stuff, right? And so you might say, okay, well, but really philosophically, what's interesting is all of the stuff that can be understood when it's given a model theoretic rendering. And the problem is there is no model theoretic rendering of any of our favorite theories of physics. The second is a point that I just alluded to, which is, well, the practice of physics doesn't just understand what's going on in a directly sort of, here's a domain of discourse, here are the relations between those things. Physicists model the universe in a variety of different ways. And I think our philosophy should be sensitive to that. So if we throw away the model theoretic rendering of the impulse, what should we replace it with? Well, that's basically what the talk today is going to be about. What I want to do is I want to update the traditional framing of the scientific realism debate in such a way that we can focus on the doing of physics rather than the describing of the world. It doesn't from that follow that I think that we shouldn't be talking about describing the world. Ultimately, we should, but that shouldn't be the starting point. That should be sort of the end. That should be the conclusion of our argument. The way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to introduce what Robert Brandon calls analytic pragmatism, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but isn't. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to argue, first of all, that analytic pragmatism gives us a really good way of understanding how our physical theories come to be about the world, how they come to tell us things about the world. And in addition to that, it will allow me to recast the realism and anti-realism debate as really a way of identifying some useful heuristics for theory construction. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about that towards the end of the talk. And then finally, since Niels forced me to, I'll say something about dark matter. In particular, I'll try to evaluate sort of how this framework works in the context of certain things that Niels has said about dark matter. And hopefully that sufficiently justifies you buying me dinner tonight.
Sure.
Yeah.
When you mentioned all the textbooks, did you leave out Wald or an NTR textbook on purpose, or you mean model theoretic in a very?
I mean model theoretic and the Tarski model theoretic and generalizations thereof, kind of. Yeah. So the angle brackets that have a manifold and a metric are not model theoretic in this sense because they can't be given that kind of. Yeah. Good. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think there are various things that can be said about like the semantic construal, a la Van Fraasen in terms of the state space approach and all of that. That I'm happy to talk about that kind of stuff in the Q&A later. Yeah.
May I ask something? You said physics is not model theoretical. What do you mean by that? Because obviously there are models.
Yes, so it's not model theoretic in the sense of the manner in which it's used in philosophy, which is Tarski, sort of Tarskian models and generalizations thereof, right? So you call the theory of physics a collection of models, sure, but you have to be sort of really, really broad in your understanding of what those models are, to include, for example, things like state spaces or various other sorts of constructions. That's not what I mean by model theoretic rendering. I mean a rendering in which is basically a generalization of the manner in which we do our favorite predicate calculus or whatever, which is I've got quantifiers, I've got interpretation functions, I've got domains of discourse.
So that's more general.
It's just different. I think, so I don't want to, one of the conclusions of the talk is that's an appropriate way to think about some theories of physics, but not others. And we need a principled way of deciding whether, sort of when to go for going for one formalism or another. Yeah, Niels?
But if Tarski can't handle GR, why care about Tarski?
I agree. That's why I'm saying we shouldn't care about Tarski. But as it happens, like Open Silos, Open Ladyman, Open, all of those books, these are not books from 70 years ago. These are books from 20 years ago. And they are talking about quantifiers and domains of discourse and extension and denotation and things like that. So if you're already on board with the idea that we shouldn't be talking about things that way, you're further along my path than I've started over here. Cool. Okay. So the way that I'm going to argue for what I want to argue for today is relatively straightforward. I'm going to introduce you to this notion of analytic pragmatism. I'm going to do that separately. I'm going to do the analytic bit and the pragmatist bit, and then I'm going to suggest how we should reformulate the scientific realism debate, or at least reformulate a debate that's sufficiently similar to scientific realism as to be interesting. I don't want to get caught up in whether this is the real scientific realism debate. And then what I'm going to do is, in having set things up, I'm going to have to demonstrate how we end up talking about the world. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to tell you the analytic pragmatist story about how we deploy observational vocabulary. And broadly speaking, I'm going to characterize realism as the view that the thing that we do when we deploy observational vocabulary is the same thing as the thing that we do when we deploy theoretical vocabulary. Right? That's the semantic in the same way from the fine approach. And that's kind of the punchline of the talk. So everything else is just filler.
Could you repeat that?
Sure, sorry. So I'm gonna use analytic pragmatism, sort of the framework of analytic pragmatism, to talk about what it is that we do when we deploy observational vocabulary. And then I'm going to understand scientific realism, or something sufficiently similar to scientific realism, as the view that the thing that we do when we deploy observational vocabulary is the same kind of thing, or the same thing, as the thing that we do when we deploy theoretical vocabulary. And I'm going to understand anti-realism as the denial of that thing. And what I want to suggest is that gives us sort of a more interesting take on what's going on, what's really at stake in the debates in the vicinity of scientific realism and anti-realism debate. Great. So let me say a little bit about analytic pragmatism. If you look at the sort of dominant narrative about what 20th century analytic philosophy was, sort of post-logical empiricism, I think the slide that I have up here sort of largely captures a very large portion of that cottage industry, right? as I mentioned earlier, I think the logical empiricists was spot on when the thought was, look, we need to sort out semantics first and then do our metaphysics and epistemology. I don't think they were right in sort of being the austere verificationists that they were. But I can drop that while still holding on to the sort of conceptual centrality of semantics. And understood in those terms, the idea is something like, we've got a bunch of vocabulary that's okay, right? For the logical empiricists, it's observational vocabulary. For naturalists, it might be some kind of naturalistically specified vocabulary. We just don't ask questions about why that's okay. We just assume that that's okay. But then we notice that our discourse involves a bunch of other kinds of vocabulary that we're a bit queasy about. Modal vocabulary, normative vocabulary, intentional vocabulary, that kind of stuff. And you go, well, if I'm a verificationist, then I'm going to have to like find the thing in the world, the observable thing in the world that grounds the truth of moral claims or moral claims or whatever. That seems difficult. But what I've realized is what I can actually do is I can continue to talk about those troublesome things, right? Morals, modals, whatever. As long as I reduce it in some sense, as long as I specify some kind of semantic relationship between the bad vocabulary and the okay vocabulary. In the context of the scientific realism, anti-realism debate, you can understand it as, well, we've got our theoretical terms here, electron, whatever. And what I want to do is I want to reduce it, if I'm Carnap, or I want to understand it in terms of implicit definition, if I'm Carnap, or I want to understand it in terms of ramification, if I'm Carnap. These are all different bits of Carnap. Or if I'm an epistemic structural realist or whatever. But ultimately, the project is the same, right? We want to characterize some kind of semantic relationship between our okay vocabulary and our not okay vocabulary. And sorry, I just need to, yeah. And so now this gives us a nice way of understanding that in the same way locution, at least the semantics of it, which is if chair goes in here, then electron goes in here, if you're a realist. So I'm treating them in the same way, right? I'm treating them both as if they're okay. If you're an anti-realist, then chair goes in here, electron goes in here. I'm treating them differently, so I'm not treating them the same way. So that's how you get that. So this is the sort of core analytic rendering of that Feinian impulse, right? So to be in the good bucket, in the okay vocabulary bucket, is to name something in your domain of quantification, for example, if you're doing this model theoretically, if you're Quine. And so then you're fine, right? Because then the in the same way doesn't have to go through any of these complicated things. Everything's just all in the good bucket. This kind of assumes that the okay vocabulary is meaningful with no real problem. I'm not going to say very much more about that, but I can say more things in the Q&A session. People are interested in talking about what makes okay vocabulary okay. Oh.
Yeah, don't touch the screen.
Yeah.
Oh.
Push it down and don't touch it again.
So the one thing I had to do was actually touch the screen. Okay. I want to just do just a little bit of terminological housekeeping before I continue, because this is going to be important going on. I've been a bit blasé when I've been talking about semantic uniformity. I've been talking about a bunch of things, right? I've been talking about, for example, what things mean. I've been talking about reference. But now I want to kind of regiment my use of these terms in a way that will be helpful for what's going to follow. So when I talk about semantics from this point on, I'm just going to talk about theories of how, given some semantic properties that are already ascribed to certain base elements of my vocabulary, how my more complex elements of vocabulary have those semantic properties distributed, right? So if you think about first year logic, or if you think about propositional calculus, the idea is something like I have my base propositions, my atomic propositions, and then my semantics will tell me how, once I ascribe truth values to those propositions, propositions that I construct out of connectives, right? So, I take P and Q or P arrow Q, and then understand how the semantic property of truth distributes across my entire language, constructed out of these base elements. Similarly, I understand how extension will work as a function of the extensions of predicates and constants. So that's semantics. Metasemantics is the prior question of what imbued those things with the semantic property that I was interested in the first place, right? So there's going to be a metasemantics of truth that tells me in virtue of what those propositions P and Q were true or false. But there'll also be a metasemantics of meaning. There'll be metasemantics of reference. I can ask a question, in virtue of what does chair mean chair or dark matter mean dark matter, and that's a metasemantic question. So given this distinction, there are two ways in which we can think about the role that something like reference plays, right? So we can be semantic referentialists. And by that, I just mean you believe in the existence of some relation whose relator on the one hand is something languagey, a word, an expression, and whose relator on the other hand is some proper subset of the world, something out there, right? So again, chair is one relatum, and that thing is another relatum. If you believe that such relations exist, then you are a semantic referentialist. And I think we should all be semantic referentialists, at least about an observational vocabulary. But you can also be a metasemantic referentialist. And if you're a metasemantic referentialist, then you're using reference to, sorry, shouldn't touch that. Then you're using reference to establish a particular metasemantic claim, right? So supposing you're a metasemantic referentialist about meaning, then you're going to say that chair, the word chair, means what it does because the word chair picks out the thing in the world that it does, right? So it's an additional commitment to ordinary semantic referentialism, right? The idea is the relation of reference is the thing that grounds the meanings of the terms that we use, right? And you can see pretty straightforwardly that metasemantic referentialism will entail semantic referentialism. You can't have reference doing any metasemantic work if you don't believe that it exists in the first place. That's all I'm going to say about the analytic side of analytic pragmatism. That's all we're going to need today.
All right.
Mhm.
One question.
Sure.
How about the evening star, morning star? So we have the same reference.
Yes.
That does not determine the meaning.
Yes.
So there has to be a distinction between reference.
Oh, absolutely. There's a distinction between reference. Right. Good. So I don't want to suggest that the metasemantic referentialist thinks that reference is meaning, right?
What does he say?
The referentialist just says reference determines meaning. So morning star means what it does because morning star picks out the morning star. Oh, which picks out, is it Venus? What is the morning star pick out? Yeah. And evening star picks out means evening star because it picks out Venus, right? The fact that it picks out Venus doesn't determine, it determines the fact that morning star means what it does, and it determines that evening star means what it does. It doesn't on its own have to determine that they're synonymous, right? That's a further commitment. That's a commitment that you couldn't have if you thought reference was just the same as meaning, and that's why I use the hedge. That's why I hedge it by saying it's determined by, right? Contrast this with the view that morning star means what it does, not because of anything in the world that it picks up, but because of facts about how we use morning star. Right? That's the thing that I'm going to argue for in what follows, and then maybe the distinction will become just a little bit more straightforward. But I'm happy to come back to that question if you're unhappy with things that I say, which I'm sure you will be. Yeah, sorry, David, you had a question.
So maybe I misunderstood. Is metasemantics kind of the universal claim, like all discourse works like that, and like the semantic referentialism is probably like if you said like for observation sentences.
Oh well, yeah, good. So it depends, right? What I'm going to say is you can characterize. So one way of characterizing a realist view is you can say I'm a metasemantic referentialist about unobservables, right? Electron means electron because it picks out something that's not sort of reduced to claims about observables. It's in fact something in my domain of discourse. These are just so nothing about my choices of semantic or metasemantic referentialism are going to be entailed by any of my claims about realism or anti-realism. But this is just the machinery that I use to specify certain aspects of my philosophical view. Yeah. Okay. So that's the analytic side of things. Let's talk about the pragmatism side of things. Now, I think pragmatism has unfortunately got a little bit of a bad rap over the years. Not entirely undeservedly, because I think a lot of people have said bad things about pragmatism. I think the most important thing for me to do today is be completely clear about the sense in which I'm using the term pragmatism. I don't want to suggest that this is the only way, that this is the best way, but this, I think, captures what I find compelling about it, and also what it is that allows me to sort of build up the stuff that I'm going to build up. So I'm interested in pragmatism in the context of discussions about semantics and metasemantics. And I understand pragmatism just to be the claim that our assessment of the content of a claim is conceptually inseparable from the impact that that claim has on our agency within the world. It's a bit of a mouthful, I'll say it again. Our assessment of the content of a claim is conceptually inseparable from the impact that that claim has on our agency within the world, right? You'll see that there are two parts to that, right? There's the content of claims. That's just metasemantics, as I just specified it, right? In particular, meaning metasemantics. Our agency within the world, in particular, our discursive agency within the world, right? Our language using agency within the world. That's studied by a branch of inquiry called pragmatics, right? Pragmatics studies the use of language. And so pragmatism is just a tethering thesis between these two things, at least as I understand it today. There are other people might understand it differently. This is what this is my fundamental claim today. And so in a nice sloganistic form, there are no metasemantic facts that are not pragmatic facts. That's how I'm going to characterize pragmatism. So Karen, sorry, Philip.
Maybe it's not quite, but can you give an example of that effect of which you can really see that in your case or in the pragmatic case it would be both a metasemantic and a non-pragmatic fact?
Something that could be do you want something that is a metasemantic fact that's not also a pragmatic fact?
Yeah, well, yes, and which, in your view, would be different.
Oh, sure. Just the view that just the view that just take an ordinary sort of Christian baptism view about the meaning of a name, or sort of broadly a sort of natural kind of meaning of things. There is a metasemantic fact, right? What makes it the claim that Niels? I mean, it's a weird thing to say Niels means Niels, but what makes it the claim that? Sorry, what makes it the case that evening star means Venus? Is I mean, there will be pragmatic facts around my use of that term, but what it is that actually makes it the case that evening star means Venus is some relation between that term and some, that thing out there in the world, and that metasemantic fact, that relation does not in any way depend on pragmatic facts about its use. In fact, that relation is what is going to ground the correctness of the use, right? So that's an example of something that will flip the arrow.
Yeah.
Cool. So now how are we going to invoke the lessons from pragmatism and shove it into what I think was quite a useful setup of the sort of analytic philosophy project. And the idea is we can reevaluate this relationship between okay and troublesome terms, taking into account lessons that we've learned from pragmatism, right? So what we're going to get from the analytic side is we want to understand the relationship between different kinds of vocabulary. I think that's a good project. What we're going to get from the pragmatist side is we're going to understand what it is that we're doing when we engage in a particular kind of discursive performance, right? And the idea there is in understanding what it is that we do when we deploy a particular kind of vocabulary, we have to describe what that practice of deploying that vocabulary is. And that gives you a pragmatically mediated relation between two kinds of vocabulary. We will use our okay vocabulary to describe what it is that we do when we use our troublesome vocabulary, right? So this is the new picture. This is the sort of analytic pragmatism picture, the pragmatically mediated semantic relations that fits into the broad core analytic project of understanding the relationship between two kinds of vocabulary, right? So the idea over here would be something like, look, I don't like modal vocabulary. I feel, it's really queasy. So, claims about possibility and necessity, that will go into my troublesome vocabulary. The standard core analytic project was understanding how that could be reduced to claims about, to non-modal claims. But now the pragmatically mediated version of that story is, well, I can use an expressively less rich language to describe what it is that I need to do in order to deploy the vocabulary of possibility and necessity, right? So, for example, I can give a possible, I can have possible world semantics sitting over here, right? Possible world semantics doesn't say anything about intent. It doesn't say anything about intention. Everything's completely extensional, right? My possible world semantics will specify a practice that allows me to deploy intentional vocabulary, right? Because it'll tell me how I can understand what it is that I'm doing when I'm talking about it, when I'm using intentional vocabulary, but the whole time specifying it using a completely extensional vocabulary, right? And that's kind of the power of this view is I don't have to think about intentional vocabulary or modal vocabulary and extensional vocabulary as being semantically related, except in the sense that it's mediated by a pragmatist understanding of metasemantics, right? With this in mind, then we can reframe the Feinian impulse. Oh, sorry, was there a question?
I'll ask later.
So with this in mind, we can reframe the Feinian impulse, right? Because the traditional framing, as I said, it incorporated a particular semantic uniformity claim. What I want to suggest is the new framing should have a metasemantic uniformity claim, where that metasemantics is understood from a pragmatist perspective. And so what that means is, as I said earlier, the basic question is no longer does electron or do theoretical terms refer. The question becomes, do theoretical terms become meaningful in the same way as observational terms, right? As a pragmatist, that's equivalent to, am I doing the same thing when I deploy theoretical terms as I'm doing when I deploy observational terms, right? And so this is the way now, I think we should look at what's going on in the scientific realism debate. We're no longer looking at a sort of relationship between observable stuff here and troublesome stuff here. What we instead have is a meta-vocabulary that describes the various practices that we're involved in, right? The practice of theoretical physics, the practice of philosophy of physics. And in that meta-vocabulary, one thing that we can do is we can specify what it is to use observational vocabulary, right? What is it that we do when we talk about chairs and tables, right? It's a pragmatically mediated specification deployment relation. And now we can say, well, are we just doing the same thing when we talk about dark matter or electrons or whatever else? And if the answer is yes, then on this view, we're realists, or at least we satisfy the metasemantic component of Fein's naturalist realist impulse. Yeah.
So what is meant by deploy?
Well, so I gave you an example just a minute ago, right? So to deploy is just to engage in a practice that tells you how you should use a particular kind of vocabulary, right? So intentional vocabulary in a possible world setup tells you that my completely extensional but otherwise impoverished vocabulary is still strong enough to tell me what I need to do in order to talk about intentions, right? Because intentions become functions from possible worlds to names to possible worlds, and that's a completely extensional characterization of what I'm doing with intention. So I have my troublesome vocabulary of intention, but my meta vocabulary specifies my meta vocabulary is purely extensional, and it tells me what I need to do in order to deploy talk of intention. And what I want to suggest is this broad framework is the framework within which we should understand what's going on with scientific realism and anti-realism. Got about, like, I've got, okay, great, fine. That is all I need. So now we can ask the question. So now we can ask the question: what is it that we do when we deploy observational vocabulary? Right? If we want to figure out if we're doing the same thing, we should ask what that thing is. And my suggestion is that at least one of the important things that we're doing is we're deploying that vocabulary in a descriptive way. Right? We are saying of certain parts of the world that they are such and such a way. Right? So what I want is, so now the understanding of realism is, if my meta vocabulary allows me to specify a descriptive deployment of observational vocabulary, and similarly, it allows me to deploy a descriptive, it allows me to specify a descriptive deployment of theoretical vocabulary, then I should be a scientific realist about that sort of practice. So the question is, what do we do when we deploy descriptive or representational vocabulary? This is actually more helpful than it seems on the surface. This is not merely restating, I mean, in a sense, it's restating the question, but in a useful way. What this points to is the idea that representation is in some sense sort of central to what it is we do when we deploy observational vocabulary. But in general, when I say representation, just think of reference, right? That's just the simplest representation relation that I can think of. There are two things that representation relation does, right? And in the case where you're a metasemantic referentialist, these two things get smushed together. So what I want first to do is prize them apart and then say a little bit about the relationship between them, right? The first thing that a reference relation does, or the first thing I think the more important thing that a reference relation does, is it establishes a word-to-word correlation, correspondence, right? Coordination, broadly speaking, right? I talk about the Statue of Liberty. Reference establishes a thing out there in the world whose properties, in some sense, vary with the properties that I ascribe to the Statue of Liberty, right? This notion of covariation of properties or magnitudes, that's really what's being captured by this notion that I call e-coordination. And reference is one way of establishing that. It's not the only way, but it's a nice, straightforward way. The second way is what I've over here called I-coordination, and this was the example that we were talking about earlier, right? Evening star picks out Venus, but what makes evening star mean what it does is the fact that evening star picks out Venus, right? And it's in virtue of the fact that evening star picks out Venus that when I say evening star and Neil says evening star, we're appropriately coordinated. We mean the same thing, right? That's what the metasemantic referentialist wants to say. So for the metasemantic referentialist, these two things collapse. What I want to suggest is we should take them apart and look at, sorry, and understand what it is that we're doing when we're able to establish that there's a kind of e-coordination relation between some aspect of our language and some aspect of the world. So the first thing that I need is a theory of meaning. I have about 4 or 5 minutes to describe thousands of pages of literature on pragmatist theories of meaning. I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to say is just a bunch of slogans. Please feel free to push me harder on it in the Q&A session. But basically, if you remember, the original title of this talk was The Inferentialist Guide to something or the other. And what I want to suggest is the right way to think about what makes words meaningful is to think about it in terms of the inferential profile associated with our use of those words. I've used the word use. Use, in this case, is what's determining meaning. This turns out to be a form of pragmatist metasemantics. And what it is that specifically specifies the meanings of different words is sorry, the sum total of all of the inferences that are mandated and that are allowed by my use of that kind of vocabulary, right? For the purposes of this talk, what's important about that view is it says nothing about meaning in any way being grounded in relations between words and the world, right? That's something that has to be added to the story. And all I'm going to say about this is there will be circumstances under which the inferential web that our concepts are caught up in is sufficiently rich and sufficiently dynamic that it just establishes the relation of e-coordination that we need. This is decidedly not going to be convincing, but at some point you're kind of going to have to kind of take my word for it that this sort of thing can be established. Again, Q&A session, push me on that as much as you like, and I'll say lots of things about that. For the yeah.
You're welcome to go a bit over time because we keep interrupting you.
Yeah.
Just that I understand. So the coherence theory of truth, would that subscribe to the high correlation?
I'm not talking about truth at all. So there's no. I'm talking only about meaning and reference here.
Okay. Go save it for the Q&A.
Okay. Right. The reason I'm being sort of intentionally vague about all of this is the actual mechanics of how this turns up is less important than what it is that we can actually do with this theory, right? Because standard semantic realism, in the final way or whatever, kind of relies on e-coordination establishing I-coordination. And what I want to suggest is we shouldn't be standard semantic realists, right? Because now we should ask the question: are the attributions concerning theoretical terms e-coordinated to the same extent as the observational terms, right? That's what I mean by are they deployed descriptively, right? So the reason I introduced the ideology of I and e-coordination was so that I could talk about e-coordination as the way of making sense of descriptive deployment of observational vocabulary. Having established that, Having said that that can be established, rather, we now have sort of had the full picture of what I want to present you today, which is that, now the question about whether we should be dark matter realists, so realists about electrons or whatever, is the question about whether the attributions of claims, I attribute to Niels the claim that, the world is, the universe is full of dark matter, and if I go over time, he'll chuck some of it at me. If that attribution can be understood, can be given an E-coordinated rendering, then what I'm doing in deploying that vocabulary is exactly what I'm doing when I deploy the vocabulary of chairs and tables. And that's precisely the semantic component of the in the same way impulse in the naturalist realist impulse. What I like about pragmatism, what draws me to pragmatism, is the idea that we can focus on non-descriptive ways in which theories can come to be about the world, right? We can think about meaning in an I-coordinated way, in such a way that we don't have to deploy all of the vocabulary in a descriptive way in order to understand a theory as being meaningful. And this is something that was not on the table when we were thinking about the core analytic project in terms of semantic reduction, right? The other advantage here is I'm talking about vocabularies. I've been intentional in not using any kind of explicitly model theoretic vocabulary. Because nothing here requires model theory, right? So we can understand representation, we can understand all of these sorts of descriptive deployments and all of that in a much broader sense, right? When I say nothing here requires model theory, it doesn't mean that we don't need to have something else replacing it. What I want to suggest is there are a bunch of alternatives for how we can think about the manner in which we understand the semantics of our theories that are not model theoretic. Right? So this is the sort of the final version of the view. If you're a realist, you're going to think that I representation in some sense just determines E representation, right? So your descriptive deployment is understood in these terms. And then you can ask the same question about electron talk or dark matter talk. And the question is, well, do I still get this I wanted a determines relation there. I couldn't think of anything else. Do I have that determines relation there or not? If I do, scientific realist. If I don't, scientific anti-realist. Okay, going to conclude. Oh, yes, sir.
Well, that Niels has given you some extra time. Perhaps you
Sure.
can elaborate a little bit on these two kinds of representation, I and E. And I'd like you to, if possible, to relate them to something we already know, the correspondence and
Coherence theory of truth.
And because you said it has
Sure.
nothing to do with it, but I don't see that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So if you don't mind that I go into the Q&A session, the time for the Q&A a little bit, I have the next. No. Okay. So think about. Okay, here's one way to approach this. Think about the problem of empty names in the sort of standard sort of philosophy language setup, right? If you're a referentialist, a metasemantic referentialist in the way that I set things up, you're going to have real trouble with empty names, right? The planet between Mercury and the Sun is the old example from Russell. If it turns out that in order for something to be meaningful, at least with respect to a kind of descriptive practice, if it turns out that something in order to be meaningful has to actually pick up some subset of the world, then you're really going to struggle to say that the planet between Mercury and the Sun even means anything, right? But if you're an inferentialist, if you're a pragmatist, you can say, no, I understand planet by the inferential connections that planet has to various other bits of my vocabulary. I understand Sun, I understand Mercury. So I represent the planet between Mercury and the Sun, by which I mean there is some content associated with that. There's some meaning associated with that. And that meaning, whatever that meaning is, that stands in the relation of I representation to my name, right? Now, in certain circumstances, what we do is we make theoretical posits, and we simply posit that there is something out there in the world that corresponds to the thing that we've named. In general, the evidence for those sorts of posits is going to be understood in terms of, well, here's my theory that posits such and such a thing. That thing has a bunch of properties that evolve dynamically, for example, in such and such a way. And that's going to be correlated with some measuring device that has some amplitude that varies in such and such a way. Through that kind of complicated sort of set of relations, you go from the I-representational character of the thing that you hypothesize to its E-representational significance, right? Because there's a kind of covariation between some linguistic stuff and some worldly stuff, in precisely the way that there would be if you were a metasemantic referentialist and you thought that the meaning relation kind of pointed in the other direction, right? So what on the normal metasemantic referentialist view of things comes out to be kind of expected, namely this kind of covariation, is now no longer to be expected. It's something that you actually have to sort of demonstrate dynamically and work hard to establish. But the advantage of doing things that way is you can talk meaningfully about any number of things, right? And this is what I'm going to come to in a second when we talk about dark matter. You can talk about any number of different things. You can be very, very specific about what those terms mean without having any without there being any further commitment to
non-ontological thing.
At the I-representation stage, not as yet, right? The interesting ontological questions come in when you're trying to understand this relation.
So is that the difference between correspondence and coherence?
Not quite. So it's definitely not correspondence, because correspondence because correspondence is it's an atomistic notion, right? Yeah. There's some from part of the world, there's some bit of our language about that. It is in a sense a coherence version, but it's not. The problem with general coherence theories of truth is they seem kind of untethered from the world. Right? I've just got all of this languagey stuff. As long as all of that languagey stuff is sort of consistent or coherent, then I can classify that particular claim as being true. That's not good enough, right? Because that just allows your theory to just slide over the world. What this requires is a pragmatist understanding of truth, where a pragmatist understanding of truth is an account of what it is that we're doing when we use truth talk, right? Exactly like how I said what we need is an account of what we're doing when we use chair talk or meaning talk. The pragmatist view is what is it that we're doing when we're using truth talk. And the short version of the answer to that question is we engage in discursive practices. Our discursive practices non-trivially interact with the world constantly, right? I might make a claim and plan my day on the basis of treating that claim as if it were true. If that claim is not true, then the world will sort of penalize me for having made that bad claim. Right? And because I've understood that claim in terms of material inference, what's really happening is the world is penalizing me for having made some bad inference somewhere. It's not clear where, right? And so that's the sense in which this is not atomistic as compared to the correspondence theory. But the idea is, in certain circumstances, for certain practical purposes, you can kind of forget about other bits of the inferential web and sort of more or less localize what it is about the world that makes certain kinds of uses of particular kinds of vocabulary good and useful. And so, but all of that is sort of all of that is kind of what's going into what I've sort of very casually just put in scare quotes and called the equals to. I hope that was marginally useful.
So the scale between coherence and correspondence, if there is any, on that scale somewhere would be either representation and E-representation also, but they would not coincide with the two.
That's right. Yeah. I think that's a good thing. I'm almost done. I could drop the dark matter stuff if you like. Okay. So, a wise man once said, where an aspiring dark matter realist runs into trouble, given the present empirical and theoretical status of dark matter research, is the semantic component of scientific realism. He's right. And then he goes on to say the common core concept of dark matter, especially the lower bound, is so semantically thin, so vacuous, that it barely means anything at all. That's what I want to push back against, right? As I understand what's going on in the, sorry, this is obviously this is dark matter. As I understand what's going on over there, the idea is something like, look, scientific realism has these three components, and before we even, before we talk about sort of being in a position to be a scientific realist about dark matter, we need to know what it is that we're going to be, that we're sort of asserting a realism about, and so far I'm totally on board with that. And then what Niels does is says, okay, well, let's look at different suggestions, different characterizations of this dark matter concept. And let's try to understand as the semantic commitments of these different views. Let's try to extract from that some kind of common core so that we can at least think of the thing that we're talking about when we're engaging in discussions of dark matter. That's what I want to push back against. What I want to suggest instead is we treat each of these practices, each of the Mond world and the modified gravity world, and sort of more, even more sort of rarefied versions of that, treat those as separate practices and understand the sense in which those practices are deploying the particular vocabulary that they do. So understand what the practice of modified gravity is doing when they deploy dark matter talk, right? Because they are deploying dark matter talk in a descriptive way as well. What they are saying is there is no dark matter, but there is a semantic conception that is at play in that practice as well. So obviously you can carve out the practices in different ways, but broadly speaking, you're going to end up with a bunch of different practices that all have some claims about how to understand what's going on when you're engaging in dark matter talk. So rather than the concept being so semantically thin, part of the problem is it's actually quite semantically rich, right? And what's unclear is the extent to which the different deployments of the term dark matter are to be understood in this descriptive way or to be understood in a non-descriptive way, right? What Niels suggests is the only sort of rational response to this situation, to the thinness of the common semantic core, is a kind of not yet realism. The only problem with this is, and I agree with this, but this is too strong. This is sort of, it's what Dennett would call universal acid, right? Because we should then be not yet realists about absolutely everything, right? There's no, just because we're in a situation where we have a sort of semantically thin conception, because we've got different competing conceptions of dark matter across different research programs. Whereas, sort of broadly speaking, in particle physics, the standard model is sort of the only game in town. It doesn't mean that we should understand, the claims about sort of what electrons are by the likes of quantum field theory in any more realistic a sense than we should understand what's going on with dark matter, right? I don't know why I have that. It's true, but not that. So I think understood as, the scientific realism, anti-realism debate is really a question about sort of how we should use our best science to figure out kind of what's out there in the world. I think we need to move past that and instead understand this as a debate over how to characterize scientific practice, and in particular, how to characterize the deployment of certain kinds of vocabulary in different scientific practices. This ends up being quite helpful because I think it very much determines a useful set of theory construction heuristics across different disciplines, right? From my understanding, what's going on in the dark matter versus modified gravity scenario, you have one domain in which dark matter theories seem to sort of be quite good and empirically adequate, but it's not extendable to the other domain in which the modified gravity sort of setup seems to work really well. This is sort of functionally not that dissimilar to what's going on in just quantum gravity research, right? You've got a quantum field theory which is sort of applicable across one particular domain. You've got general relativity, which is applicable across another, and it seems as if ne'er the twain shall meet. But of course, what we can then do is understand what it is that these different research programs are doing when they deploy this vocabulary, and then say, okay, well, in a theory going forward, if I'm going to be a realist, if I'm going to think that this aspect of the theory should be understood descriptively, then this is the kind of theory that I'm going to develop. If I should instead understand the vocabulary is being deployed non-descriptively, this is the other kind of theory that I should develop, right? In the quantum gravity example, which is a domain that I know a little bit better, the idea is something like, look, if we take the if we understand quantum field theory in a as descriptively deploying vocabulary of force carriers, of particles, then we should understand, then we should construct a theory of quantum gravity that also sees gravity understood descriptively in terms of a vocabulary of descriptively deployed force carrying particles. On the other hand, the sort of other approaches, causal set theoretic approaches, or loop quantum gravitational approaches, will not think that you should understand gravity in terms of a descriptive deployment of any kind of vocabulary. And I think that's the interesting claim associated with the scientific realism and realism. It's not about what does our best science tell us about what's out there. It's much more what is our understanding of the manner in which our best science deploys vocabulary, telling us about how we can develop, how we can further develop our science going into the future. And so, yeah, so so the moral of the story, as I said, should be understood as a characterization of scientific practice. And then the central question becomes, do we use dark matter talk in the same way as we use chair talk? And that, sorry, I should have brought this up earlier. And that gives us a good theory construction heuristic. Great, so my final slide is just to recap. So this is what I said I'd be doing today. I said I'd be updating the traditional framing of the scientific realism debate to focus on what it is that we do with physics, right? What it is that we do with our deployment of physics vocabulary, rather than in terms of description of the world. I introduced analytic pragmatism. I suggested in my sort of hand waving about I representation and E representation that it provides a good way of understanding what a physical theory says about the world, and hopefully at least sort of made it plausible to think of it as grounding a helpful theory construction heuristic. And then in the last few minutes, I'm happy to say much more about this in the Q&A session, but that's basically what I think of as a useful way of thinking about what's going on with realism and anti-realism in the dark matter context. Thanks very much.